The wind was a physical presence, a brutal hand shoving against her, tearing at the thin fabric of her worn dress. Dust coated Alara's tongue, gritty and relentless, a constant reminder of the land's indifference. She stumbled forward, each step a small victory against the vast, empty landscape that stretched out under an unforgiving sky. 3 days had passed since the stagecoach left her at the dusty crossroad with little more than the clothes on her back and a name scrawled on a scrap of paper, Silas Croft. A rancher said to live somewhere out here, seeking a woman to help with his isolated homestead. Help. The word felt like a cruel joke. She needed salvation, not merely help. After Thomas, after the whispers turned to outright cruelty, after the last coin was spent on passage to this desolate edge of the world, there was nothing left but this desperate gamble. Fear was a cold stone in her belly, heavy and constant. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of the man she was going to meet, fear of being alone in this harsh, beautiful, terrifying wilderness. The sun beat down, a relentless furnace, baking the earth and drawing the last reserves of strength from her limbs. She squinted, scanning the horizon, praying for a sign of habitation, any sign that she hadn't walked into the maw of nothingness. Just when despair threatened to buckle her knees completely, a faint ribbon of smoke curled against the distant hills. Then, the outline of a structure low and solid seemed to coalesce from the shimmering heat haze. A ranch. It had to be. A desperate surge of adrenaline propelled her forward. As she drew closer, the place took shape, a small, sturdy house made of rough-hewn logs, a corral, a barn, all weathered and blending into the land as if they had grown there. It was stark, solitary, utterly exposed to the elements. A man emerged from the barn, tall and lean, moving with a quiet, purposeful grace. He stopped, watching her approach, a still, dark shape against the pale backdrop of the sky. There was no welcoming gesture, no wave, just that silent observation. As she finally reached the gate, breathless and trembling, she saw his face. Weather-beaten, lined, his eyes a pale, unsettling blue under the brim of his hat. He didn't speak immediately, his gaze sweeping over her dust-caked dress, her tangled hair, the raw fear in her eyes. It felt as if he was assessing a stray animal, weighing its usefulness, its potential burden. "Croft?" she managed, her voice a dry rasp. He gave a short, affirmative nod. His silence was unnerving, a heavy cloak that seemed to smother the already thin air. They said you needed someone." It sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. He studied her a moment longer, then turned, pushing the gate open. "Come in." Sun's hot, he walked towards the house without looking back, assuming it seemed that she would follow. There was no warmth in his invitation, only a simple statement of fact about the heat. Yet it was an invitation nonetheless. She stepped through the gate, her boots crunching on the dry earth, leaving the vast emptiness behind her, stepping into an equally daunting, but perhaps survivable unknown. The air around him felt still, guarded. She had expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Kindness? Pity? Neither seemed present in this man. There was only a quiet self-possession, a deep-seated solitude that felt as ingrained as the lines on his face. She followed him, the stone of fear still lodged in her gut, but now mingled with a flicker of desperate hope. Inside, the house was dim and cool, blessedly shielded from the sun's glare. It was sparsely furnished but clean, everything practical and well-maintained. A rough-hewn table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. Silas moved with quiet efficiency, pouring water from a pitcher into a tin cup and pushing it across the table towards her. He still hadn't said much, his presence a quiet force in the small space. Alara drank, the water cool and life-giving, easing the dryness in her throat. She felt his gaze on her, steady and appraising, but not unkind, just watchful. "Alara," she offered, setting the cup down. "My name is Alara," he nodded again. A slight dip of his head. "Silas," his voice was low, a rumbling sound that matched the quiet power of his build. He didn't ask about her journey, her past, her circumstances. He seemed to understand, without words, that she was here out of necessity, driven by hardship. He simply gestured towards a small room off the main living area. "You can rest in there. Water's outside by the pump." There was no formality, no elaborate welcome. Just a direct acknowledgement of her need and the provision of basic necessities. It was starkly impersonal, yet in its own way, deeply practical and devoid of judgment. For the first time in months, she felt a fragile sense of relief. He wasn't asking questions she couldn't answer, wasn't demanding explanations for her appearance, wasn't looking at her with the pity or scorn she had grown accustomed to. He simply accepted her presence for now. The room was small, with a narrow cot and a single window looking out onto the endless plains. It was plain but clean. She sank onto the cot, feeling the exhaustion seep into her bones. Sleep claimed her quickly, a deep, heavy slumber free of the anxieties that had pursued her across the country. When she woke, the sun was lower, casting long shadows. The smell of cooking filled the air, something simple stewing. She emerged hesitantly. Silas was by the fireplace, stirring a pot. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Feeling better?" he asked. It was the most words he had strung together. "Yes," she murmured. "Thank you." Dinner was eaten in near silence. Simple fare, but nourishing. He ate steadily, his movements economical. She watched him, trying to glean something from his quiet composure. He seemed entirely self-sufficient, accustomed to solitude. Why did a man like this seek a companion? The question lingered, unanswered. As darkness fell, the silence of the ranch deepened, broken only by the sound of the wind sighing around the logs. It was a profound, isolating silence, yet being inside, under a solid roof, with another human presence, no matter how taciturn, felt like an incredible luxury. The fear was still there, a faint echo, but it was overlaid with a cautious, tentative hope. She had found refuge for now, but the vastness outside, and the quiet mystery of the man who lived within these walls, remained daunting. Survival here would require more than just finding shelter. It would require understanding this harsh world and the silent man who navigated it with such apparent ease. She felt utterly out of place, a fragile thing in a land built of rock and wind and resilience. She would have to learn. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the demands of the ranch. Alara found her place slowly, tentatively. Silas didn't issue commands. He simply performed tasks, and she, observing him, followed suit where she could. She learned to pump water, to tend the small garden patch, to keep the house clean, to mend his worn clothes. It was hard work, physical and demanding, but it felt grounding. Each completed task was a small victory against the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that had plagued her for so long. Silas remained a man of few words. Their conversations were functional, brief exchanges about chores or the weather. Yet, his presence was a constant, steady anchor. He was fair, providing for her needs without expectation of gratitude beyond her contribution to the household. He was also observant. She would catch his pale eyes on her sometimes, a quick, assessing glance, but he never lingered. It was as if he was cataloging her strengths, her weaknesses, her resilience. One afternoon, a harsh storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple, the wind whipping up dust devils before the rain came down in sheets. Alara, caught outside, scrambled for the house, shaken by the sudden ferocity. Silas met her at the door, his face impassive. He didn't fuss or scold, simply handed her a dry cloth. Later, watching the storm from the window, she saw him outside, methodically securing loose shutters and checking the corral, his movements calm and deliberate despite the tempest raging around him. There was a quiet strength in him, a deep connection to this land and its unpredictable nature that she found both intimidating and reassuring. The isolation of the ranch was profound. Days bled into weeks with no sight of another soul. The outside world felt impossibly distant, a place she had escaped but that still held the power to haunt her. She knew, intuitively, that her past was a fragile thing, easily shattered if exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. Silas never asked about it, and she was deeply grateful. It allowed her to exist here, in this present, without the weight of who she had been or what she had endured. But the silence also allowed her own thoughts to echo. Memories of Thomas, his sudden, devastating departure, the pity and judgment in the eyes of those who had once called themselves friends. The shame. It still clung to her, a ghost she couldn't shake. Yet, the physical demands of the ranch, the simple necessity of survival, slowly began to push the ghosts back. Her muscles ached, her hands grew calloused, but her spirit, battered and fragile, began to mend. She was learning resilience not from grand pronouncements, but from the quiet example of the man she lived with and the unforgiving land they shared. One evening, while she was mending his coat by the lamplight, he spoke, unprompted. "Winter comes early here." His voice was low, almost a murmur. Hardest time, it wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact, a quiet acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. It felt like a shared understanding, the first hesitant step across the chasm of their solitude. He wasn't just providing shelter. He was acknowledging her presence in the face of future hardship. It was a simple thing, but in the quiet of the ranch house, under the vast, starry sky, it felt significant. A fragile bridge was being built, not with words, but with shared silence, shared work, and the quiet, unspoken recognition of mutual need in a world that offered little comfort. The true test came not from the elements, but from human intrusion. One dusty afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch with a deliberate pace. Silas, who had been working near the corral, straightened, his body tensing almost imperceptibly. Alara felt an immediate prickle of unease. Strangers were rare here. As the rider drew closer, she saw it was a man, burly and weathered, his face hard. He dismounted at the gate, his eyes scanning the ranch with a possessive glint. He introduced himself as Frank, claiming he had heard Silas was looking to sell, that the land was rightfully his anyway due to some murky, decades-old boundary dispute he'd unearthed. His voice was loud, aggressive, a jarring contrast to the quiet of the ranch. Alara watched from the doorway, her heart pounding. Silas remained calm, his stance firm. "This land ain't for sale, Frank," Silas said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. "And your claim's worth less than the dust you rode in on." Frank laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We'll see about that, Croft. There's ways of making folks see reason. Especially when they're alone out here." His eyes flicked towards Alara, a sneer on his face. "Didn't hear you had help. Or company." The insinuation hung heavy in the air. Alara felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, cutting through her fear. She wasn't just company. She was here, working, living. Silas didn't dignify Frank's remark with a response. He simply held the man's gaze, his pale eyes cold and unwavering. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Frank, seeing he wouldn't provoke a reaction, spat on the ground and remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Croft," he snarled before riding off the way he came. The moment he was gone, Alara rushed outside. "Silas? What? Who was that?" He watched the receding figure until it was just a speck. "Trouble. Some folks think just 'cause a place is remote, it don't belong to nobody but them that's willing to take it." He turned to her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in his eyes. A weariness, perhaps, but also a quiet determination. He'll be back. Maybe not alone. The threat felt tangible now, pressing in on their small, isolated world. Alara felt the familiar fear, but it was different this time. It wasn't the paralyzing despair of being utterly alone and adrift. This time she was here on this land, in this house with this man. A fierce, protective instinct rose within her. This place, this fragile piece, was hers now too, in a way she hadn't fully articulated before. She looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his face, and knew she wouldn't run. The vulnerability was still present, but it was tempered by a burgeoning sense of belonging, a fierce resolve to defend what little they had built against the cruelty of others. The slow build of trust, forged in shared hardship and silence, solidified in the face of this external threat. They were in this together, like it or not. The confrontation came a few days later, just before dawn. Two riders this time, Frank and another man, equally rough-looking. They approached stealthily, but Silas, ever watchful, was waiting. He woke Alara with a quiet word, handing her a rifle. Her hands trembled as she took it. She had never fired a gun in her life. "Stay low," he murmured, his voice calm despite the danger. "Don't shoot unless you have to. Just be ready." He moved to the front door, his own rifle in hand. Alara positioned herself by a window, the heavy weapon feeling foreign and terrifyingly real. She watched as Silas stood on the porch, a solitary figure against the pale pre-dawn light. Frank shouted insults, threats, demanding Silas come out and settle this. The second man dismounted and started towards the barn, axe in hand. That's when Silas acted. A single, clean shot rang out, not aimed at the men, but at the ground near the barn door, kicking up dirt and splinters. It was a warning, precise and deadly serious. The second man froze, dropping the axe. Frank roared in frustration and anger, drawing his own weapon. But Silas was faster. Another shot, aimed at the bridle of Frank's horse, sent the animal rearing and whinnying, throwing Frank to the ground. Before Frank could recover, Silas had stepped off the porch, moving towards him with a quiet, menacing determination that needed no words. Seeing the turn of events, the second man scrambled back onto his horse and fled. Frank, left alone and disarmed, saw the look in Silas's eyes and knew he was beaten. He scrambled to his feet, nursing a bruised arm, and retreated, casting hateful glances back but offering no more threats. He rode off after his accomplice, leaving only the dust and the tense silence behind. Silas watched them go, then slowly lowered his rifle. He stood there for a long moment, the tension draining from his body. Alara, still gripping the rifle, felt her own adrenaline begin to recede, leaving her weak and trembling. She set the rifle down and went outside. Silas turned as she approached. His face was grim, but there was no fear there, only the quiet exhaustion of a man who had done what needed to be done. He didn't say anything, just met her gaze. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, a grudging respect, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement of a shared ordeal. "They won't be back," he said finally, his voice rough. She nodded, unable to speak. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. It wasn't empty or isolating. It was filled with the weight of what had just happened, a silent acknowledgement of their reliance on each other. She looked at the ranch, bathed now in the first rays of the rising sun, solid and real. She looked at Silas, standing beside her, a quiet protector forged by the demands of this land. She had come here vulnerable and broken, seeking refuge. What she had found was not just a place to hide, but a place to stand, a place to fight for. Resilience wasn't just about enduring. It was about finding the strength to defend what little beauty and peace you could carve out of a harsh world. She had been looking for a rancher seeking a companion, but what she found was a quiet partnership built on shared grit and unspoken understanding. They stood together, watching the sunrise paint the sky, two solitary figures on a vast, indifferent plain, no longer quite so alone. The fear might never entirely disappear, but it was now tempered by a quiet, unyielding strength. She was no longer just Alara. She was Alara of the Croft Ranch, a woman who had found her footing in the most unlikely of places.